When I first met the central figure in the Lavra movement, it was a bit of a drama. I was 22 and a recovering Protestant living in a Greek Orthodox monastery in a Jewish country surrounded by a largely hostile Muslim population. I was living at a monastery in Jerusalem, and I was reading about one of the great monks in history, a guy named St. Savas, and I mentioned in really broken Greek to my abbot, gosh, it would be great to meet him. And he said, well, let's go and meet him. And I said, oh, so he said, pile in right now. So we jump in this French jalopy, we head out to the West Bank, and we almost didn't get there because the Israeli soldiers didn't believe, well, the abbot didn't have the proper papers, and he didn't believe he was an abbot, and so it ended at this screaming match between the abbot and Israeli soldiers, where the abbot pulling his beard, saying, this is real, showing his cross, and eventually they let us in, and we were pelted by rocks as we headed to the monastery. I got to the monastery, I locked my door, and he said, no, you're new here, aren't you? We open all our doors, to put down all the windows to let everybody know there's nothing to steal. And we arrive at Marsavas Lavra there, and he goes, now you can meet St. Savas. Now, St. Savas has been dead for 1,500 years. Yet, they take his body, and this is where he rests now in a glass box, but on his birthday, so to speak, they bring him out, they put him on a chair, give him new vestments, which means you still get clothes on your birthday, on your 1,500th birthday, and he said, well, let me introduce you to him. And so we went up, and I must say, for someone 1,500 years dead, he looked pretty good. I mean, his skin was a bit leathery, his hair was a bit thin, but nonetheless, he still looked pretty good after 1,500 years. And I then sat with St. Savas for the 12-hour service, which transpired, and I had lots of time to think about the system he is best connected with, that is the Lavra. And I'll also share the germination of those thoughts with you today. Now, academically, I am a refugee here. I teach comparative religion. My dissertation was on, way long ago, on comparative monasticism. And so in some sense, what I'm going to share here today is a bit of an intellectual journey as well as something that we hope we all can learn from. Because I think there's a lot of resonances and learning from the ancient monastic world that we can take into the modern communal movement. Okay, so the degree to which ancient monastic communities and the modern communal movement are related to one another is debated within the field. The link seems so obvious to me, but the objectors are plenty, and we can discuss that as you want, as to why monasticism is seen as so separate from the modern communal movement. But I'm convinced that there's actually deep sort of DNA connections between ancient monasticism and the modern communal movement, as should be apparent. If we look at the term intentional community, which is probably the term that casts the broadest net, the determining modifier is intentional, the forging of a particular kind of community by deliberate choice. So the members of an intentional community reject the customary modes of living and consciously choose an alternative. Therefore, the meaning behind an intentional community is only found relative to the norm. A group of unrelated people living closely together in yurts is normal in Mongolia, but virtually everywhere else, it would be an intentional community, even in California, where I'm from. Intentional communities are by nature extraordinary communities, which is a term a lot of social scientists like to use for them anyhow. They're truly alternative communities, which always begs the question, alternative to what? So there are two simultaneous processes that are behind the formation of an intentional community. On the one hand, there's the active rejection of the dominant modes of living, and that's matched with the strident striving towards a newer, higher ideal, a utopia. And so those that found or find themselves in intentional communities say no to the society as they find it, and lift up another ideal, life as it should be in their mind. And bearing in mind these dual processes is important to understand what's going on, because it is driven by both a deep pessimism about the world as it is, but it is also driven by a deep optimism about the world as it could be. Now, by contrast, a hermit or a recluse has the same pessimism about the world, but they also reject the idea of society itself. Not so with intentional communities and ancient monasticism, at least the common life form. They have a problem with society, but they also have a belief in community itself. And so both monasteries and modern intentional communities represent attempts to create a parallel alternative society. Now, the bridges between the standard society, the normative society, can vary, but oftentimes they're outside of traditional societies. They're surrounded by walls or by wilderness that form some sort of boundaries, though, of course, there are integrated urban communities as well. Initiation rites often are required to enter these communities because you're entering a new kind of counterculture. Our community in California has a sign near its entrance that says, "Live differently." And no one has yet to ask, live differently from what? They know, live differently from what everyone else is doing. The dynamic is apparent in the origins of Christian monasticism as well as Hindu and Buddhist, which we can't go into here, though they're quite similar. Christian monasticism begins not at the beginning of Christianity, but in the 4th century. The first time you see the term monk, monachos, appear in a text is 324. This is a couple of decades after the Roman Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity and throws the entire weight of the Roman Empire behind his new religion. And so Christianity moved from being a rather small, impoverished, persecuted group of religious eccentrics to now Christians were lining the halls of power, dressed in the finest robes, preaching a modified gospel that had been massaged for the masses into something that was much more palpable to the normal person. And the masses came in droves. The stampede of new converts entered into the church because it was manifestly profitable in worldly terms to become a Christian. The monks were those who felt that the church had lost sight of its original radical message. They marked their protest not by their voice, but by their feet. They moved out to the wilderness in Egypt and in Syria and to try to live the radical spirit of what early Christianity was. And they were known as monachos in Greek or ehidaya in Syriac. Both terms means the same thing, means solitary. And solitary, that was both a physical thing, most of them lived alone, but also they were solitarily focused on God. They didn't have the distractions of all these new Christians in the world. And they sought a higher form of life, quite literally in the case of the stylites who would climb up poles and live 30, 40 feet above people. Now, this crucible of the deserts, of the wilderness of Syria and Egypt, provided the backdrop for one of the most enduring forms of alternative living that the world has known. Yes, many of them were monks, many of them were hermits living alone, but there was also a great period of experimentation in communal life. And it was a creation of a counterculture of a variety of different alternative communal living forms. And this is what I see as the DNA link to modern intentional communities. They are both predicated on a desire to live differently, a desire to try to find an alternative to the way most people are living. Now, institutionally, monasticism has been far more successful in terms of longevity and scope than modern intentional communities. This strikes me as a safe one. The term for the dominant mode of monastic life, koinobium, from kinos, common, bios, life, is not just something you find in Christianity, but you also find it in the Hindu matas, the Buddhist sanghas, throughout the world in different forms. Now, the differences between monastic forms across the world is important, but they all follow a basic pattern of trying to live a life in common that is an alternative to the norms of the area. Now, the equivalent of the conobium in the modern intentional community environment is sort of the full commune, where very little private property, aspirations towards self-sufficiency. And if you look historically, communes have been less successful. While the ideal of a full commune is still held, most communes don't last into the second year, let alone into the second generation. And when they do, they tend to become more individualistic and, shall we say, less kenobetic. And so the appraisal that monasticism has been more successful seems safe to me. However, it may be also that we've looked at this dichotomy between the kenobetic monasteries and the hermits and said, hey, we've got to fit into one of those two, and we've left out perhaps the most the form of life that might be most fitting to the modern world, which is the lavra. So perhaps a lavra is a model. So let me give you some background on this lavra system. The Encyclopedia of Community, which if there was a Bible for the ICSA, it might just qualify. On their entry into monasticism, it says, I quote, there are just two kinds of monastic life, the hermit and the kenobetic. And I don't fault the author here because that is the two modes that have mostly survived. But the majority of monks in Palestine in the 4th, 5th, 6th century were actually part of a lavra, not a kenobetic monastery. So what is a lavra? Let me give you a thumbnail sketch, and then I'll talk about why I think it's useful for today. Lavras were communities in which the monks lived in clusters surrounding a series of central buildings. The central buildings normally had a church, a bakery, some storage facilities. It was usually that limited. Sometimes it would have an infirmary or guest quarters. The monks lived in walking distance of the central area, but they lived in separate cells or houses that showed a great degree of diversity. Some lived alone, some lived with 2 people, some lived with 3 people, some 4, and we do have one instance of 5 people living together. They would have most of their meals and their life separately in their cells or houses. They would come together for maybe 1, 2, 3 times a week for prayers and for meals. Undoubtedly, they came together more than that, but those were the formal times they came together. The term lavra in Greek, we see this in Homer and throughout the Greek text, means passageway, lane, or alley. However, we shouldn't see it as sort of a lonely path, because when the term lavra was translated into Syriac, they chose the term shuka, which is related to souk, which is a marketplace. So really, we should see something like a definition of lavra as an intersection of souls, a place where lives interacted with one another. One of the few definitions we have in the ancient sources was a church father named Evagrius, who says, a lavra is a place where the dwelling place is separate and distinct, but the common life accomplishes a single goal, divine love. Now, the history of the lavra, I'll go through very quickly. The first lavra we hear about is in the 330s, founded by a guy named Hariton, who came to Jerusalem as a pilgrim. He got captured by bandits. They hid him away in a cave. He liked it so much he stayed and started the first lavra. The pinnacle of the movement comes with St. Savas in the 6th century, the monastery, the lavra that I visited at the beginning of this talk. We have 2 primary sources, the Lives of the Monks of Palestine by Cyril of Scythopolis and the Spiritual Medal by John Moscas. It begins to decline in the 7th century. By the 9th century, there are no more lavras left, and it becomes an honorific title for important kenobetic monasteries. So the Great Lavra on Mount Athos, for example, the lavra there's several important lavras in Russia, Kiev, for example. St. Sergius is another one, but that has become something different. At their peak, they never got to be big, each individual one. They would be as small as 12, as big as around 70. There's one instance of 150 monks being together. The constraining factor seemed to be water, as is often in the Middle East. They needed to find unsettled places in the Judean desert with enough water, and there weren't that many of those. And so they usually were on cliffs, on cliff sides. Many of the cells and houses were actually caves that they would build out in front of, which provided natural air conditioning and protection from the weather. If you looked at them from above, they sort of looked like spiders, all these pathways converging in a central place. They were designed so that the formal interaction would occur in the core structures, and most of the day-to-day life happened in the cells. We know the cells were relatively close to one another because the monks would talk about being able to hear the other monks sing at night. The central facilities, at a minimum, had the church and the bakery, but sometimes they were much larger. We know Erasmus, one of the heads of a Lavra, put a kitchen in, living quarters for himself there, guest quarters, a refectory, which most of them didn't have. And so you could have large central cores as well. And herein lies one of the distinctive elements of the kenobetic form versus the Lavra form. They were trying to find a balance between individualization and a privatization of life with the value of living in community. The monastic world really struggled with questions of community versus individual, just like we do today. There were some who really valued the hermits, who were alone with the alone, to quote St. Athanasius in his text on the first monk. Later writers, such as Basil the Great, who I did my dissertation on, argued that the hermit not only wasn't Christian, he wasn't even human, because how do you love another if there's no one around you to love? And the second camp, the Cenobium, or life in common, they sought uniformity. They want everything to be the same in it, while the hermit stood for individualization, for difference, for diversity. So this challenge between uniformity, communal existence, and difference, private existence, was something that they were discussing. And the Lavra tried to find a happy medium, a golden mean in between them. And so, yes, they had a common life when they were at the core, but in their private cells, they were often very different. Some got up very early and prayed for 5 hours in the morning and maybe just had one other service. Others had a rule of getting up a little bit later and praying 5 times throughout the day. Everybody had their own different spiritual life. And you can see this also in degrees of fasting. Some would just eat, they mostly ate bread, but some would eat bread, water, and dates multiple times a day. We also see from the sources that there were monks who would eat bread and water just a few times a week. There's also a source that says there was one cell that just ate bread on Sundays. A friend I know who lives in the West Bank now, he eats a loaf of bread every 2 weeks and a quarter pound of sugar. So there would be diversity in how you eat. The diversity also came in ethnicities. They came from all over, which was very different from most monasteries. And in part, this was because people would go on pilgrimages to Palestine and come from all over the world, but also because of the Lavra system. In a monastery, in a kenobetic monastery, everything was the same. So if you came from Gaul and wanted to go to a monastery in Palestine, you were forced to follow the Palestinian practices. In a Lavra, it would be different. In your cell, you would follow the systems that you knew. And so the different Lavra cells, one might be following Egyptian rules, one might be following Gaul rules, one might be following Roman rules, yet they would have a common set of practices in the core. And it's something that the Lavra allowed it to do. And this often led to a lot of cross-pollination of ideas. Because if you think about it, if you joined a kenobetic monastery, there were no decisions for you to make about how you should live. It was all given to you. At a Lavra, every cell was talking about all the time how you should live, what your spiritual life should be, how does God want you to live. It was a little bit like a ICSA conference, where everybody is just talking about the details of communal life. And as a result, they end up discussing it with one another. And so I think there's something in the system that leads to it. There's also then the second aspect, which if you can imagine the Judean desert today, it was even more scarce resources back then. And so they would put things in life that made sense to put in common, and they would put that in the common core structures. Now, this means that unlike the Kenobetic monasteries, where things would just be given to you, they were constantly talking about what makes sense for us to communalize, what makes sense for us to centralize. And so a bakery, very resource intensive, they always put in the middle because that made sense. And so unlike the Kenobetic system, where everything was just given to you, they were constantly discussing how do you make the best use of resources. And this would be the second aspect that I think would be unique about the Lavra, this discussion of optimization of resources and balancing them between the private and the communal. Now, the Lavra declines for a lot of reasons. The Islamic conquest of the area, it became very hard when the church wanted to take control over the monastic movements because there was so much independence and diversity, no single person in control. And then there was a lot of infighting that happened among the Lavras. And so it quite literally got dissected. At one point, the new Lavra monks took knives to the great Lavra monks over a theological issue on origin. So to conclude, we still see it, though, somewhat in the skeets of Mount Athos. To conclude, what are the implications for today? I think the same issues in the ancient world we see today in terms of the monastic, those wanting to live in an alternative way. That is, how do you balance individual life and communal life? And if you look at our society, we are becoming more and more hermitized. We're living more and more isolated existences. Many of us in this room would probably admit, if pressed, we love the idea of the commune. We love this idea of everyone sharing everything in common. But to conserve words, it hasn't really worked in the modern world very well. They all end up being more and more individualized. And so perhaps there's room in the present environment for a Lavra-like incarnation. Perhaps instead of being inspired by the Cenobium or the hermit, we can be inspired by this long lost Lavra. Perhaps there is a golden mean. And in some ways, I think the co-housing, the successful co-housing, is a sort of Lavra-like existence. But oftentimes, they don't share any common ideology among them. But if we're looking for a model that encourages diversity, yet still has a common unity, if we're looking for a model that encourages resource optimization, but still allows for privacy and for some degree of separate existence, maybe this could work. Because the Lavra aspires for a union of souls, but they quite literally see different pathways for getting there. And the strength comes from the very intersection of those paths, as the name indicates. It was a place of fertile intersection that I think perhaps can inspire us today as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this very interesting discourse on monasticism. Are there any questions out there for Stephen? Okay, let's start here and then go up there. So he will be first.
Yeah, just a detail. The Lavra word means in Portuguese to work the land, to work the earth, to grow everything.
Oh, really? Oh.
And also means to go to the river and to look in the sand beside the river for gold, to mine the gold.
Oh, there's lots of good metaphors there.
So just a detail for those who likes details.
And it's also a name in Portuguese, isn't it?
A name?
A name, a woman's name.
No.
Oh, in
no,
Danish it
Laura. Laura
Laura.
means Lavra.
A Lori, I guess.
Yeah, Laura.
I
But
wonder if it's the
Lavra
same.
means
Oh.
to mining, to get gold from the sand, and even to grow vegetables and plants and everything.
Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Stephen, for that inspiring talk, because I just yesterday talked about this dilemma between individual freedom and collective responsibility, so from a sociological perspective. And to combine this with the monasteries is also an plan of our next research project. So I think we should connect. That's really very interesting. And my question to you now, what do you think that, many of these communal practices in the past, in more traditional communal settings and societies that were mainstream at that time, and today in our individualized societies, this is actually something to live differently, yeah? You pronounce that. So, you emphasize that. So, what is actually really different and alternative today? Or is it just a former mainstream that is kind of marginalized in nowadays societies?
Yeah, it's interesting because monasteries began as the counterculture and then became the center of culture. It was co-opted by those in power, and there's a normalization, so you get to the Middle Ages, and that was part of the institutions of power. And I think that's partly why modern intentional communities don't want to identify with monks, because they're kind of part of what we're trying to get away from, in some sense. And so I guess, if sort of modern intentional communities, if I understand your question correct, become normalized, isn't that kind of we win? If it becomes so normal that people don't think we're living differently by living in communal, then maybe that's a sort of a stage in the evolution of how humans live that it would be successful, and maybe we can hope for that. But right now, it's still seen as, probably anybody who lives in community knows, you all have a relative who thinks you're weird, right? That's how it goes.
Okay, there's a question right here. This will be the last one, because the next session is starting soon.
You may have already said this one because I went briefly away, but how was the work shared out?
Yeah. So, I actually skipped it because of time. But you spend most of your time in your cell doing this stuff, but then there's common duties that come to it. So just like and it's very similar to co-housing. You have a set number of, I don't know if there's a set number of hours, but you had a central garden. Everybody had, one meal a month, that you do. But most of your time was spent in your cell or in your house. And they did have, it's interesting, you see references to something like communal buying. They didn't have Costco in the ancient world, but they sort of went to the Costco equivalent and purchased huge amounts of grain that they would store in the middle and then pass it out. And somebody's job was buyer, and he would take the mule to this. There's stories of them traveling quite far to get good deals on grain, and then traveling by mule back, and then everybody would share that. So yeah.